Okay, welcome. We're going to talk I'm going to talk about fallacies. I'm going to do this in two different videos. This one is going to go through just chapter 4 and the list of fallacies in chapter 4. And then in a separate one, I'm going to go through some of the examples from chapter 4 and identify some fallacies from some of the examples they talk about. So you're not going to see my face in this video. I'm just going to use PowerPoint. So first of all, what is a fallacy? Well, basically, fallacy just means a mistake in reasoning. But specifically, when we talk about it in chapter 4, we mean that there's certain common types of mistakes that people make in reasoning. And a fallacy is one of those identifiable types of mistakes in reasoning. And people have all sorts of different lists of these. This book has a list. The website we looked at the other day has a list. Other textbooks have other lists. They have a lot in common, but there's also some differences from list to list. It doesn't really matter too much which list you use as long as you learn the important ones. Okay, the book categorizes fallacies in 4 different ways, and I think this is a useful way to think about it. The first type of fallacy is the fallacies of relevance. Fallacies of relevance are when the premises are just not relevant to the conclusion. You give reasons, but the reasons don't actually have anything to do with what you're arguing for. So the question here is to ask yourself, does this really have anything to do with what I'm trying to prove? Those are probably the most important. We're going to spend a lot of time on those. Then there's fallacies of defective induction. That's a complicated term, but basically it means that the premises are relevant, but there just isn't enough content there to warrant the conclusion. So they sort of show it, but not nearly enough. So the question to ask yourself here is this that I'm giving really enough reason to believe what I'm claiming? Or do I need a lot more than this? The third type of fallacy that the book looks at is fallacies of presumption. That's when the premises assume too much. You always have to have assumptions. It's not a problem to have assumptions, but your assumptions have to be something that's reasonable to ask your audience to assume. So ask yourself, do I ask my opponent to assume something that he or she has no reason to assume? This is particularly a problem when nobody notices that the assumption's being made. There's a lot of times when people think an argument works, and then somebody eventually says, wait a minute, for that argument to work, you have to assume the following, and nobody on the other side really should be accepting that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's fallacies of ambiguity, and that's when there's some word or phrase that changes meaning in a way that invalidates the argument. So ask yourself, am I being consistent in how I define and use my terms? All right. So my plan is to walk through each of these that the book mentions and talk briefly about what each one of them mean. Here we go. Appeal to the populace is what we already talked about as the bandwagon fallacy. It basically means that instead of giving you reasons to believe my claim, I tell you that everyone else agrees. So I don't give you a reason that I'm right. I just tell you, well, everybody thinks this. Sometimes I tell you everybody really cool believes it, or everybody who's intelligent believes it. You know, all leading intellectuals think this, or all the coolest people think such and such. So the thing you need to ask yourself is, wait a minute, is the fact that other people agree relevant to the argument? If not, then I've got a fallacy. So if it doesn't really matter what other people think, if the question is this a good thing? Is this an accurate claim? Then it's sort of irrelevant whether other people agree or not. And so if it's being used that way, then it's a fallacy. Second, appeal to emotion. We talked about this a lot already. I just want to emphasize what we said before. This is when instead of giving you reasons for my claim, I use emotion to distract you from the logic. But remember, an appeal to values is not the same thing as an appeal to emotions. If I say we should do this because it's fairer for people, that's not appealing to your emotions. It's appealing to your commitment to make things fair. If I say this is really cruel, don't do it, that doesn't mean that's an appeal to your emotions. It's an appeal to your belief that being cruel is a bad thing. Now, you'll be emotional about that, but that's not by itself a bad thing or a bad kind of logic. Also, using emotive language may not be fallacious. I can use emotive language, we'll talk about that later, but I can use language that calls up emotions if it doesn't distract from the logic. If it actually pushes you to pay attention to the logic, then that's not necessarily a fallacy. But if it distracts you from the logic and is used in place of actually giving you reasons, then it's an appeal to emotion, fallacy. So the question to ask yourself is, what's the purpose of the emotional content? Does it make you think more carefully about the logic of the argument, or does it actually distract you from the logic? The third thing is a red herring. This is I think about it this way. Somebody challenges your conclusion, and you respond by bringing up something else that has nothing to do with it to distract them from your real point. So that's an example. That's the kind of thing that would happen with this fallacy. So the red herring, ask yourself, does this have anything to do with what we were talking about? If it doesn't, it may be a red herring. There's something at the end of the section that the book talks about, which is the fallacy of missing the point. And that's very, very similar. I'm not too worried if you can't tell them apart. But missing the point is when, rather than trying to distract people, you actually are missing the point. You're confused, and you're giving an argument for something, but the thing you're arguing for isn't the conclusion that was the question. So you're busy arguing for one thing, and somebody says, well, yeah, that's true, but that's not what we were talking about. And so that's called the fallacy of missing the point. We talked about straw man, the straw man fallacy. That's very important, but we've already talked a lot about it, and I won't say anything more about it here. We talked about ad hominem, or attack on the person. Also very important, but I won't say anything more about it here. Finally, there's an appeal to force. That's when you don't even try to convince someone logically. You just tell them they'd better agree with you or else. And that's not even really an argument. It's barely worth calling a fallacy, but it's clearly not a good reason to believe something. These days, a lot of times this happens in terms of a threat to label people negatively. You hear things like, if you don't agree with this, it'll show you're disloyal to our country, to our company. I've also heard it with country. I've heard people say, if you don't agree that we should have gone to war, you're selling out our soldiers. If you don't agree with this, it'll prove you're a racist. And so people don't want to be labeled, so they agree. Well, that's just an appeal to force in a certain way. It's not an appeal to reason. It's a fallacy. Then there's fallacies of defective induction. This is where you have something that gives you a reason to believe what you're saying, but it's not enough. The first one is the argument from ignorance. Now, we haven't talked about this one yet, but this is one of the ones I want you to know for sure. So pay close attention to this one. Don't misunderstand what it is. This doesn't mean an argument that gets the facts wrong. Somebody may make an argument and say something wrong, and you may say, well, that's just ignorant. But that's not an argument from ignorance. That's just where you think they were ignorant of something. What this means is when you have the following type of argument. Somebody says, well, we don't know for sure that A is false, so probably A is true. In other words, we argue from the ignorance of A, we don't know, to the conclusion, therefore. It's an argument actually based on or from or relying on our ignorance of A. So you need to ask yourself, is the fact that we don't know for sure enough to make my case? Usually it isn't. Now, sometimes in weird cases, to not know something is enough to be pretty sure that it must be true. But in most cases, just because you don't know something's false doesn't make it true. And that's not enough reason to make it true. The second thing is appeal to authority. We talked about this already. And notice that it's an appeal to inappropriate authority that causes problems, not just an appeal to authority of any kind. Third, we talked in class about the false cause, the anecdotal, and the slippery slope fallacies. Okay, the book covers the same ideas using false cause and hasty generalization, and they're a little hard to tell apart, so let me explain the difference. Hasty generalization is when you see something happen just once or just a few times, and then assume from that it always happens. You know, I ate my oatmeal this morning and then there was a car crash. Wow, that must be always what's going to happen when I eat my oatmeal. False cause is when you see A and B happening together, maybe even several times in a row. So you might actually see it repeated again and again, but you still don't have the right to assume that A caused B. And if you do assume that, you are committing the fallacy of false cause. This is the correlation and causation problem. So an example of this is that if you look at it, the number of bars per square mile and the number of churches per square mile are correlated. If there's a lot of bars per square mile, there tend to be more churches per square mile as well. That doesn't actually mean that bars cause churches or that churches cause bars. What it means actually is that both of them are based on the population per square mile. And the more people you have, the more both bars and churches you have. There's a very funny website right here, which is full of all sorts of strange and wonderful correlations that obviously are not causation. Go check it out if you want sometime. Then there's fallacies of presumption. These are fallacies where you're making an assumption you really have no right to make, at least no right to ask your audience to make. And again, the big problem is when nobody notices the assumption. One of them is called the fallacy of accident. And we won't talk much about this, but basically it's when you have something that's usually true and you assume it's true in every case, or specifically in this case, even though this case might be an exception. So the premise is some rule, like such and such is always true. And you need to ask yourself, am I sure that rule applies here too? The book gives an example somewhere of somebody saying, or maybe it's in one of my notes, says something like, it's always wrong to hurt people, therefore surgeons are doing wrong when they hurt people to cut into them to save them, from heart attack. Well, that's the problem with that, is it's not always wrong to hurt people. It's wrong to hurt people unless there's a really good reason for their benefit to do so, or something like that. So you're using a general rule and applying it where it shouldn't really apply. So ask yourself, if you use a general rule, ask yourself, am I sure this is not an exception? Otherwise, you're assuming something you have no right to assume. The more interesting one is the complex question, what we called the loaded question the other day. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. This is a question which the question is asked, and in the way it's asked, it actually assumes part of what you want to prove. And so one of the examples we gave the other day was when if you say to somebody, have you stopped beating your wife? And the problem is, if you say, have you stopped beating your wife, it assumes you used to be beating your wife. And if you say yes or no, you're sort of accepting that assumption. But here's a more common way that this kind of thing happens. It comes from the textbook. It says, how can you expect the majority of the voters who rent but don't own property and don't have to pay the tax to care if the tax burden of others is made even more unfair? Okay. Notice what this does. It's asking, how can you expect the majority of the voters to care? But actually, if somebody wants to vote for this property tax increase, whatever they're talking about here, it's not because they expect the majority of the voters to care or not care. It's because they don't think it's unfair in the first place. So what's happening is this question assumes that the tax burden is unfair. It assumes that those who rent won't be affected by the tax increases on the property, and then it builds those assumptions into the question and asks the question in a way that sort of slides those assumptions right by. So especially when people ask hypothetical questions, if this is true, then how do you expect this? Remember that you don't have to accept the hypothetical part. You can say, yeah, but it isn't true. You can say here, yeah, but it isn't made even more unfair by this. And then begging the question. This is a very important one. This is a circular argument. It's when one of the premises contains the very conclusion you're trying to prove, or something very close to it. And the trick is that sometimes this happens without people noticing. There's an example on page 137. The argument says this: there's no such thing as knowledge which cannot be carried into practice, for such knowledge is really no knowledge at all. Now that sounds like an argument. The conclusion is there's no such thing as knowledge which cannot be carried into practice. But what's the premise? The premise is that such knowledge is really no knowledge at all. In other words, if something can't be carried into practice, it's not really knowledge. But take a look at the premise and the conclusion there. The premise says, if something can't be carried into practice, it's not knowledge. And the conclusion says, something's not knowledge if it can't be carried into practice. So basically, they're saying the same thing. This isn't an argument for the conclusion, it's just the conclusion restated. It's saying there's no such thing as knowledge which cannot be carried into practice, for actually there's no such thing as knowledge that can't be carried into practice. This is an example of begging the question. Okay. Finally, there's fallacies of ambiguity. This is when you have something changing meaning in the middle of the argument that messes it up. So first of all, there's three quick kinds of ambiguity that the book mentions: the fallacy of equivocation, amphibole, and accent. Equivocation is when you have a word or a phrase that's ambiguous. Amphibole is when the grammar is ambiguous. You can take something to mean two different things depending on how you interpret the grammar. And accent is when the emphasis is ambiguous. Somebody says something, emphasizing one part of it, and you change what they mean by the way you emphasize what they said. And then there's two other things that I want to mention quickly. Oh yeah, by the way, there's an interesting real-life example on page 150. It's very long. It's based on a court case. But that's an example where there was an important issue riding on the equivocation of a particular argument. Okay. Finally, let's talk about composition and division. These are fallacies that relate to things being made up of parts. So here's a jigsaw puzzle, and here's the parts it's made up of. Now, the fallacy of composition is when, or division first. Division is when you assume that something true of the whole has to be true of the parts. You say, hey, this is true of the whole picture, so it has to be true of the individual pieces. You divide them up and think that it's still true. For example, that team was a great team. She played on that team, therefore she must be a great player. This assumes that if the whole team was great, every individual person in it must have been great. But you know, that may not be true. It might be that a great team works because everybody worked together, and it was able to take just sort of normal average players and make them great because of the way they worked together. So it's not true that if the whole team was great, the individuals had to be great. Or the same thing in the other way around. You might have a lousy team and yet have a really good player on it. Composition goes the other direction. It's when you assume that something's true of the parts has to be true of the whole. Somebody says, you know, every part of this machine is well designed. Therefore, the whole machine is well designed. Well, not necessarily true. Maybe all the parts are well designed, but they're put together in a really stupid way, and the whole machine just doesn't work at all. Okay, the most important fallacies for you to know, the ones I'm going to test over, are these: the straw man, the appeal to emotion, the attack on the person or ad hominem, the appeal to inappropriate authority, begging the question, and argument from ignorance. Those are the ones I'm going to ask questions about on the test. They're also some of the ones most likely to come up in your papers, although you might find some others, false cause and other things like that, that will be helpful too. Hopefully this will be helpful for you. I'll see you in a week.